Before we get into the stories, I'm excited to announce I have a new channel called Monster Trail Cams. Here's a quick trailer for my new channel. The link is below. Monster Trail Cams is your ticket to the unseen and supernatural. Sourced from a vast network of mystery hunters worldwide, our channel reveals a collection of strange creatures and supernatural events that will leave you on the edge of your seat. From shadowy figures lurking in dense forests to inexplicable entities prowling under the cloak of night, each chilling clip peels back another layer of the world's untold mysteries. We release new episodes several times a week. Okay, now let's get to the stories. In the mid-2000s, I was attending college at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Growing up in Iowa, I'd always wanted to find a way to be closer to the ocean. So, I loved the location and figured I'd get plenty of time to explore. But then I always felt so overwhelmed with studying and assignments, and it ended up that I seemed to spend most of my time inside. Anyway, my roommate Amanda and I decided to abandon our schoolwork one weekend and finally go have an adventure. We decided to go to Assateague Island. It's a barrier island and a refuge for a lot of different wildlife. I was most excited to check out the feral ponies I'd heard about. There don't really seem to be many places where you can see wild horses. We decided to camp even though it was the off-season and would be pretty chilly. At least there were no crowds. We borrowed a bunch of gear from our hardcore camping friend and headed out. We stopped at the visitor center and the rangers told us where we would be likely to see the horses. They told us just to make sure we put away all of our food items whenever we were away from the campsite. We showed them the bear-proof cooler we had borrowed, and they said that was fine. We set up our camping spot and went to the recommended trail. When we were out there, we caught sight of horses off in the distance. They had told us to stay at least 40 feet away from them, but we were able to get a good look. We were happy to get a not-too-distant view of horses across an inlet. But then we were really excited when the herd stormed through the water and toward the area where we were standing. We must have seen 3 different herds while we were hiking around that morning. We had some binoculars so we could spot them in the distance. We were satisfied with our sightings by noon. We took the rest of the day to have a cookout and just relax on the beach. I was ready for bed early and got in my sleeping bag right after sunset with my book. I must have fallen asleep right away. Next thing I knew, I was woken by something howling. I'm familiar with coyotes and wolves, but this didn't sound like that. It was higher and screecher and gave me goosebumps all over, and I could have sworn it was getting closer. I convinced myself it must be one of the island foxes. I fell asleep again, but then this horrible growling woke me again. It was really low and guttural. I could hear something rustling around outside of the tent. It was probably half an hour before the noises stopped, and I could sleep again. The next day, we decided to take the wildlife loop trail. It was maybe 3 miles long and gave good views of the marsh and the forest. We ended up staying out there a long time exploring. By the time we decided to go back to camp, we were both pretty tired, and it was almost sunset. We came over the crest of a dune and could see our tent a ways away. It looked like it was fluttering in the wind more than it should be. I could tell there was some stuff on the ground by the tent. I remember saying how weird that was. We got closer and could see the tent door was hanging unzipped and flapping around. The stuff on the ground was a bunch of our stuff, our sleeping bags and clothes. What the hell? We were thinking someone had come to rob us. We knew we hadn't left any food unsecured. It didn't seem like the work of an animal because the zippers were just pulled down like a person would do. Inside the tent, there were big muddy prints all over the floor. If I didn't know better, I would think they were from a giant dog. Our bags had been opened and all the contents had been removed and thrown around. All the food that had been securely locked inside the cooler was gone, and everything was covered with sand and mud. We were just mystified. Then I heard that howl that I'd heard the night before. I was instantly petrified. I can't tell you how primal it sounded. Me and Amanda rushed out and heard it coming from toward the trees. We both screamed when we saw this huge werewolf-looking creature. It was obviously eating something. It looked like a 6 or 7 foot tall wolf, but it had the torso of a man. I had my binoculars around my neck. It had a long snout and sharp fangs. When it howled, it sounded a lot like a human scream. It was facing sideways to us, so I couldn't really see its eyes, but its back was kind of hunched and it had massive shoulders. It never looked toward us. It seemed to finish what it was eating and turned away and went into the trees. We were literally shaking from the shock of seeing that thing. We knew we had to leave. We pulled everything out of the tent and shook it off as best we could and threw everything in the trunk. We raced out of there and we did stop at the ranger station, but it was after hours and we couldn't see anyone around. We didn't know what to do. We ended up going home and called them the next day and described what we saw. I have no idea if they took us seriously or thought we were just seeing things. When you live on a farm in Texas, you hear all kinds of crazy stories. Stories of things that you can't quite explain. You always laugh and say, yeah, okay, whatever, until it happens to you. Then you become that crazy person telling the story. I was helping a family friend out on their farm. They ran cows, horses, a few goats, and chickens. Pretty typical for a family farm in Texas, right? I remember we were all sitting around after a long, hard day. I was sunburnt and cranky, but I was still adjusting to the Texas heat. In my opinion, there is a real difference between it and heat anywhere else. But anyway, we were sitting around talking about our day. My friend started telling us about what happened to him the night before. He had gone out to check the cattle because something had woken him up. He had just made it to the fence line when he started hearing something strange and realizing that the animals were shifting uncomfortably. He figured we had some coyotes out and let the dogs loose for some protection. He listened and watched a bit but didn't hear anything else, and the dogs didn't react to anything, so he headed back to bed. As we listened, we basically just shrugged the story off. Coyotes aren't uncommon and the dogs help keep the herd safe, so we weren't too worried. This was all pretty common. We had done a herd count as per the usual when making our morning and nightly rounds, and everyone was accounted for. We wrapped up our post-work hangout and all headed into the house for bed. However, that didn't last long. It was only a few hours later when I heard a horse scream. If you have never heard a horse scream, count yourself lucky. I jumped up and raced outside, but didn't hear anything more. I didn't let that fool me, though. I knew that something was out there because horses are very intuitive. I grabbed my flashlight and woke my buddy up. He was an insanely deep sleeper, telling him to get up and grab his gun. I didn't know what we were going to find, but we were going to find out. He threw on his boots and we headed to the pasture. All of the animals were on high alert. The horses were tossing their heads, snorting and frantically stomping their feet. The cattle were milling about, staying close together and snorting. I had never seen the animals act this way, not over a coyote at least. I pointed my flashlight towards the back of the field, swiping it left and right. I couldn't see anything, but the anxiety pouring off the livestock was thick. I could almost taste it. It was starting to set me on edge also. I jumped the gate and walked along the fence line, ready to jump out if they started to panic. I did not want to get trampled. I was about 20 steps in when I saw movement. I couldn't make out what I was seeing, but it was fast and it stayed in the shadows. I walked closer, trying to shine the light where I had last seen movement, but couldn't catch anything. I started to give up and let my buddy know that whatever it was gone, and that we should bring the horses in for the night. But that's when I heard it. It was growling low and deep, but it was also loud. It made me jump and my hands started shaking. I began backing up, not wanting to take my eyes from where it had been. I didn't want to lose sight of it, but I also wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, glowing eyes had appeared low to the ground, and they were staring back at me. I heard one of the horses behind me snort and felt the air rushing past me as they started to run and mill around. They could sense something was wrong, all while I was watching something I couldn't understand form in front of me. I kept my flashlight low to the ground as the eyes grew larger. I knew it was getting close. I raised the light quickly and screamed like a banshee when I saw a dog-like creature creeping towards me with no fur, completely naked. But what scared me the most was the long, sharp claws and fangs. I started stuttering, trying to talk to my buddy to get him over to me. I seriously couldn't believe my eyes. I had always laughed when people told their stories. But then, this. As I watched, the creature stalked towards me, opening its fang-filled mouth and growling. Luckily, I realized that my buddy had stayed outside of the fence, but he was now screaming at me to get out of there. He was afraid to take a shot and hit me or one of the horses. I started running backwards, one hand on the fence rail to guide me. I didn't want to take my eyes off this thing again. Finally, I made it back to the gate and to where my friend was. He took the flashlight and kept it aimed exactly where I had it. I climbed over the gate so as not to take any chances about losing a frightened animal, and by the time I came down on the other side, the creature was gone. I was shaking and stuttering. I don't think I have ever been that scared. We agreed to go wake everyone up. We needed to do a count and make sure we had someone on guard in shifts. As we all made our way back out to the pastures, everything was calm. None of the animals were on alert. The dogs were even silent as they ran ahead of us. Nothing seemed wrong, at least not at first. We started our count and quickly discovered we were short one horse. The cows and goats were all there, but we were missing one of the mares. So we started the hunt for her. She couldn't have gone too far. It didn't take long to find her. We had barely started walking the pasture when one of the other hands yelled out. We all ran over, and there she was, but she was gone, with only 3 puncture wounds in her neck. We spent the rest of the night working in shifts to protect the rest of the herd. It was a long, sad, scary night, one I would never want to relive. I can't laugh anymore when I hear about the crazy sightings out there. I have lived it. It isn't made up. It is scary and it's real. When I was 17, I saw something that to this day gives me chills. Ever since I was a child, I loved being in the water. I was on my community swim team since I was 5 years old, which eventually turned into me joining a travel team and competing in the tri-state area around New Jersey. Naturally, when I got to high school, I was excited to join the swim team and continue perfecting my craft. This passion eventually led me to get a job as a lifeguard at my local beach, where I got paid to be around or be in the water. Could a job really get better than that? Because I wasn't able to work until I finished school and practice for the day, I took the later shift at the beach, meaning the sun would start setting before the end of my shift. When it started getting near sunset, I would clear the water, turn off the beach lights, and call it a night. While people technically could sneak back onto the beach after I closed up, it typically didn't happen. There's a certain risk to swimming by yourself, especially at night, so most people were content with just heading home once the sun set. Me, on the other hand, I loved taking a dip after my shift. I was pretty confident in my swimming abilities, and the water at the beach was relatively calm. So it didn't much bother me to be in the ocean by myself, even in the dark, since I didn't wade too far out anyway. One Friday evening following my shift, when the beach was empty, I found myself floating in the ocean, washing away the stresses of the week. As I floated on my back and looked up into the sky, the stars were abundant, and I remember thinking I'd never felt peace quite like I was feeling in that moment. I was humming to myself as the water lapped over my arms, when suddenly something caught my eye. Darting across the sky, then pausing directly above my field of vision, was a tiny bright green light. At first, I thought it was just a tiny insect hovering above me, maybe a discolored lightning bug who'd found itself too far away from the shore. But reaching up into the air, I became more confident that this thing I was seeing was no bug, but something miles away. Many miles. Maybe a shooting star? Maybe. But whatever it was, it seemed to hover right above me indefinitely, and I thought shooting stars typically fizzled out pretty quickly after hay appeared. Suddenly I watched while 5 purple lights shot out from the single green light. They then formed a circle around the single light and began rotating counterclockwise. The display was hypnotizing to say the least. But deep in my gut, I started feeling as though something wasn't right. There was no occasion to be setting off fireworks or any reason for strobe lights to be dancing in the air. In fact, peering back towards the shore, I could see the beach town was eerily dark, not a person or party in sight. And with this, the mesmerizing lights began to turn rather terrifying to me, because now I was running out of justification for them. As if in response to my growing fear, the lights stopped circling and suddenly converged into one blindingly bright beam. The beam transitioned from green to yellow to white, and a quick look around had me convinced that it was pointing directly into the water at me. It's difficult to describe the emotions that overcame me in that moment, but for all the strength I could manage, I knew I needed to get out of the water, and I needed to do so fast. Suddenly the beam began to grow as if it were coming closer, and instinctively my body sank underwater. Realistically, I know the water wasn't going to protect me from whatever was tracking me from above, but I did know the water was cloudy and could give me a false sense of security under its haze. I held my breath longer than I'd ever done before and fought against the little current in a dire effort to make it back to shore. My mind and body were in conflict with each other. My body wanted to flail as fast as humanly possible, while my mind warned to keep calm and not create a lot of movement. As I continued swimming, I could see the light from the beam above refracted into the water around me, but moving around in what I presumed to be searching motions. It was not shining directly onto me anymore, and whether or not that was thanks to me retreating into the water or not, I didn't care. I just wanted to remain as shadowed as possible. Finally, when I reached the shallows, I was unable to rely on the water for protection any longer. I shot out of the ocean and onto the beach and ran as fast as humanly possible across the sloshing wet sand. All the while I was looking up at the beam in the sky, which was now again surrounded by colorful spinning lights, and began screaming at the top of my lungs for help. My commotion must have been deafening, and as I continued sprinting up the beach, lights in the surrounding beach homes began to flicker on, and silhouettes filled the windows. I waved frantically, begging anyone for assistance, when finally my legs gave out, and I found myself face up in the sand once more looking at the lights. I can't say for sure what caused what happened next, but suddenly the lights converged into themselves once more, but instead of turning into a beam, they condensed back into that single green light I'd initially seen before shooting off into the distance and disappearing amongst the stars in the sky. In an instant, I was surrounded by people from the beach houses who were wrapping me in towels, picking me up and carrying me to the safety of their homes. They all were rather panicked, having feared I'd been attacked by a shark, and were asking me if I was hurt. It took a minute to finally catch my breath, but once I had, I told them a story that left me far more shaken than the mere threat of a shark attack ever has. I lived in a pretty rural development that backed up to a national forest in Northern California. My house was toward the end of a cul-de-sac, so we didn't get a lot of cars coming through, except for people coming home after work. What made our neighborhood really interesting was the old De Hoyt place at the end of the street. It was the perfect poster child for a haunted house. The iron fence was a little rusty, the windows were big and covered over. Even the yard looked like it was haunted because of the crazy long grass and big bushes growing in weird places. All of us kids knew to stay away from it. I mean, to us the house looked like an axe murderer lived there. So there we are, all of us kids in the neighborhood, maybe about 10 of us, and somebody has a great idea to play kickball in the street. Fine. We go on having fun until Mark kicked the thing too hard and it went over the fence and into the De Hoyt yard. I do remember that we all stopped and stared at him and then turned around to look at the De Hoyt place. The grass was so high, I couldn't even see where the ball had landed. Mark refused to go get the ball. He said it was because we weren't supposed to trespass, but I think it was just because he was scared. All the kids started nudging one another. "You go get it." Well, some angel must have been looking out for me, because that was when my mom called me into dinner, so I had a great excuse to say I couldn't do it. After dinner, though, there was still plenty of daylight left, so we got booted back outside. We couldn't play kickball anymore, though, thanks, Mark, and nobody was brave enough to hop the fence and go look for the ball. No problem. We decided to play hide and seek instead. We did a few rounds of hide and seek, and one of the kids was seriously a champion hider. It took forever to find her. Our games dragged on until the streetlights came on. I'm competitive, so I wanted to win at least one game tonight. If it couldn't be kickball, it was going to have to be hide and seek. I knew somebody's parents were going to start calling them home, and then we'd have to stop, and I'd go to bed a loser. I didn't want that. So I talked my friends into one last game. Mark was it. He started counting, and everybody scattered. Except me, because I'd thought of the perfect place to hide. I pretended to hide across the street, but as soon as I saw most of my friends hide, I ran for the end of the street. The fence was too tall for me to jump, but the gate had been locked with a padlock and chain, an old one. It was open just enough, and I was just skinny enough to squeeze through. I remember thinking something weird, that being in the DeHoit yard felt weird. That is the only thing I can think of to call it. It felt like I was being watched. That creepy feeling made me not want to go deep into the yard, but I figured I didn't have to. I ducked into the tall weeds by the fence and waited. I heard Mark yell out, "Here I come!" And then I remember hearing feet pounding the pavement. Still weird that it kind of felt like sound was muffled, even though I was really close to the fence. My hiding place was pretty airtight, though, because I kept hearing "got you" for a while. I think it was about 10 minutes. I was starting to congratulate myself on winning the game when I heard, "Hey, there's still 2 missing!" Then someone's front door opened, and I heard a parent yell for Devin and Amanda to come inside. The others started really hunting for us because we were just so close to being done with the game. I really didn't want to make it this far and lose, and since I was close to the fence, if they got close enough, I'd be spotted. I figured I'd sort of army crawl backward to get into better cover. There was a big bush nearby, so I backed toward it. By now it was pretty dark, and I couldn't really see the kind of bush I was hiding by, just the branches hanging low near my face. It had a lot of thick leaves, and it was really tall. Belly down on the ground like I was, all I could smell was dirt and crushed grass, and some weird musky smell. It smelled like a wet dog, but not quite, which I remember thinking was kind of weird, because we hadn't had the sprinklers on in a while, and I didn't remember seeing any dogs out. And then I heard a growl. It was a deep sound, like a really big dog. I'd always heard people say that the hair on the back of their neck stood up when they were scared, but I'd never had it happen to me. Well, it was happening now. The big bush rustled, but it sounded like something was pushing the branches, not just the wind blowing. That wet dog musk smell got stronger, and I didn't dare turn my head to look, but I just knew that something was looking at me. Then that growl came again, deep and close. I don't remember what happened next. I don't remember how I got out of there. All I know is I was suddenly outside the fence and running for my house like monsters were chasing me, screaming that there was something horrible at the DeHoit house. It took my parents a long time to get me to calm down, and even then I refused to go near the windows or doors until they were closed and locked. My dad said I probably ran into a bear, and I was lucky to get away. My brother said it was just a dog and I was being a baby. But I don't think it was either of those. Later I did some research on weird things in the area and found some information on Sasquatch. It described the same musky, wet dog smell I'd smelled that night. The growling, too. I told my dad what I found, but he didn't believe me. No one did. I've never gone into any woods past dark since